To the topic of civil rights. We'll dive right into it. I don't want to waste anyone's precious times. I hope your studies are going well. This will be the last chapter before your first exam, so just a reminder to review the questions for the exam or the notes for the exam at the end of each of the lectures and review the lectures as well. And I think you'll all do very well if you do that. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to talk about the African American experience that set the pattern for civil rights. We'll talk about the women's ongoing quest for economic and political rights, the political experience of Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans, as well as the right of other disabled groups, same-sex partners, transgender, etc. This chapter could be an entire course, so we are going to be going through it very quickly, but it does not mean that each individual group doesn't deserve sufficient amount of time and discussion. Please watch, I've put up many videos. Please go ahead and watch that. Your book also suggests lots of places to get other information from if you want to dive a little deeper. All right, we'll start with civil rights. The freedom to participate in a full life of the community, to vote, to use public facilities, and to exercise equal economic opportunity. Some see our civil rights as a steady march toward equality, that we've been moving forward and forward and forward, forward moving. Others see that our rights are expanding and contrasting, maybe 2 steps forwards, 3 steps back. We definitely need to be diligent in watching that our rights are not taken away, and we need to pay attention, because if you believe in this second, that it's expanding and contrasting. We have seen some evidence of that in the last couple of years. So race and civil rights. This was originally a revolt against slavery. The clash over slavery was made present in the abolition movement. This was a movement demanding immediate and unconditional end to slavery. This did not happen immediately. There were economics involved. As we talked about in the earlier lecture, the North was opposed for moral reasons, but the South felt that slavery needed to spread in order for them to economically survive, and Congress was haunted by this issue. The politics of it was even more difficult, negotiating a balance in the number of states that were assured slave states and assured freed states. There was the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and 1850, where they drew a line between North and South. I think you have a map of it in your book. So any states west and north could be free states, and south of the Missouri line were going to remain slave states. This led to one of the famous cases, Supreme Court cases. They made a decision, and it basically, this was Dred Scott v. Sanford. A slave went to a free state. Let's see, federal government went to a free state, but the court agreed that he was not free because the freedom did not change. His role as a slave did not change just because he moved to a free state. So this was a devastating case for our march towards civil rights in regards to race, but we will see that eventually the Supreme Court overturned itself and disagreed with this court ruling. After that was in 1857, before the Civil War. leading up to the Civil War. After the Civil War, Lincoln had his famous speech, Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. Shortly after that, the Congress and the United States amended the Constitution to abolish slavery in the 13th Amendment in 1865. The 14th Amendment freed slaves and applied the federal Constitution and the Bill of Rights to the states. This is the amendment that we referred to in our last lecture that had selective incorporation, that was used for selective incorporation, applying all of the rights to the states as well. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed freed slaves, male slaves, the right to vote. But this did not change things quickly or at all in many places. We went through a period called Reconstruction. It was a failed effort pursued by Northerners and Southerners to rebuild the South and establish racial equality after the Civil War. But unfortunately, the Southern states went on to require literary tests for voters, knowing full well that slaves had not gone to school for a very long time. They'd spent their lives working on mostly on cotton farms. And they started what they called Jim Crow laws. These were state laws. It was a system of racial segregation throughout the U.S. South that lasted from 1890 to up until the Civil Rights Movement in 1965. And it was often violently enforced. African Americans could not go to white schools, play in parks, go to zoos, eat at a white restaurant, stay at a white hotel, go to a white hospital, pray in a white church, or vote. These state laws were being upheld. They were called Jim Crow laws, named after a minstrel entertainer that used to paint his face black and entertain. For those of you who would like to know a little bit more information, I did recommend that you check out the New York Times, the daily podcast. There's a special, I think they've had 5 episodes so far. It's called 1619, and let's see if I have this here. Yeah, so this third episode that they did on September 6th is the birth of American music, and it talks a lot about the Jim Crow era and explains what happened with that music, and then how African music has affected American music. It's very interesting. So it might give you a little better understanding of the Jim Crow period and why it was named Jim Crow. And also, this is in bold, so that means you will be asked something on the exam for that. And then in 1896, there was a Supreme Court ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson. This was a case that was ruled. This was a gentleman bought a first class ticket to go on a train, and he was told he could not sit in the first class car. He was not 100% black. I think he was like an eighth black or something like that. And they said he had to sit in the third class car. And so he brought it to the Supreme Court, and they ruled not in favor of him. They said that, well, according to the 14th Amendment, everything is equal, and we believe this is equal. It's just separate. So basically, requiring that separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites was okay in 1896. Later, we'll learn that this was overturned, but it was a lot later, something like 70 years later, 50-something years later, in Brown v. Board of Education. But in the late 1800s, the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, it's okay to have separate facilities. So your textbook has 2 terms in it that I'd like you to remember. De jure discrimination. This means when the laws and practices are explicitly deny civil rights. They're explicitly discriminating. De jure meaning of the law. De facto discrimination exists when, without explicit laws or regulations, but is a little bit more subtle and embedded into society. So maybe there's no laws, but an example could be, I think they called it redlining, when they didn't allow certain races to buy homes. They would just ask certain questions, and the realtors would not show those homes to people of color. So it might not have been a law, but de facto discrimination. In fact, it was discriminating. So please remember the difference between the two of these terms. So the fight for racial equality started a long time before we experienced the civil rights movement. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, took cases to court and chipped away at these Jim Crow laws one after the other. President Roosevelt appointed 8 Supreme Court justices. This court was sympathetic, and remember, President Roosevelt was a president before there were term limits for the presidency, so he had a long time in office, and so he was able to appoint the most amount of Supreme Court justices. But it was a very sympathetic court by the time, and they sympathetic to Black civil rights claims. So by the time Brown v. Board of Education came along, they were really the case was about desegregating schools. There were a couple cases put together, and these families were saying, our children want to go to this white school, which is closer and better, but we can't. But they were really fighting against the idea of separate but equal. Let's watch a little bit here. Let's go ahead here.
By the early 50s, segregation was frayed by the war and torn in spots where the court had acted. The white primary was outlawed. Housing covenants outlawed. Some graduate and law schools were forced to admit blacks. But the court was aware that the big fight was still to come. The schools, K through 12, white children and black in the same classroom.
Southerners assumed that if grade school kids were in a desegregated setting, they'd get to know each other and they'd get to date each other and then they'd marry each other. And that was the strongest taboo that the South held.
Led by Thurgood Marshall and other young lawyers like Robert Carter, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was running or aiding cases all over the country. The court picked 5 and consolidated them into one set of arguments, forever known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. As oral arguments approached, people camped outside the building to assure themselves a seat in the courtroom. NAACP lawyers Marshall and Carter were up against a formidable adversary, John W. Davis, a former presidential candidate making the last of his 140 appearances at the Supreme Court. But his arguments had a familiar ring. Separate wasn't necessarily unequal. Blacks should be happy with the way things were. Didn't states have the right to educate their children as they saw fit? When the 3 days of arguments were over, Davis was heard to remark, "I think we've got it won, 5-4, or maybe 6-3. The justices scheduled another hearing on the case. But before that could happen, Chief Justice Vincent died of a heart attack. President Eisenhower chose to nominate Earl Warren, formerly the governor of California. On May 17, 1954, there were signs. Some of the justices' wives showed up. Some clerks were tipped off. Then reporters rushed the courtroom.
Warren starts off in a bland manner, and you can't tell for a while as he's delivering the opinion what the outcome is going to be. And then he comes to the key line and he says, and we unanimously hold that separate but equal has no place in the Constitution. And it was just electric in the courtroom when he said unanimous.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we unanimously hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson in education is no more, and in practice, Plessy v. Ferguson itself is no more. The era of Jim Crow, constitutionally speaking, is over.
This was precisely what we urged them, almost in that language. So it was gratifying to have the opinion come down almost in the language of the argument that we made to them.
In 1951, I'd used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Brown said that that was over. The hand-me-down tubas that I played in the high school band from the white high schools, it said to me that that was ended. And it said to me that at some point, I would not have to travel from Atlanta to Greencastle in Indiana to get an undergraduate degree. That my family, my cousins, my neighbors could go to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 was for me the Magna Carta. It was the second emancipation. It was a great moment.
All right. So, unfortunately, it didn't change everything right away. That was in 54. We still had a lot of movement to come. We had Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. This was, most of you know, refusing to ride in the back of the bus. Rosa Parks was arrested, and so people turned out in Montgomery and decided to boycott the buses and walk for months, and up to, I think it took almost a year until there was direct intervention by the court that demanded that Montgomery desegregate their buses. In 1961, there were groups of young people that rented Greyhound buses. They were called the Freedom Riders. They protested segregated interstate bus lines and terminals. And then you also had events where firehouses and police dogs and forms of police brutality was used, and for the first time was captured on film, and nationwide TV people witnessed the treatment of African Americans in the South, and ordinary Americans started to rise up and help defeat the segregation cause. Martin Luther King had the March on Washington in 1963. That was a pivotal point where he had his infamous "I Have a Dream" speech. And shortly after that, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It forbid civil rights violations. It used the Interstate Commerce Clause, saying that the federal government had the right and the authority to regulate businesses, and part of the regulation was that they were not allowed to make unequal facilities such as bathrooms and parks and stuff like that. And then federal government could withhold funds from school if they didn't desegregate. So this was in 1964, 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education, because there was not a whole lot of movement of schools immediately desegregating even after the court case. Because remember that our judicial court system, once a court rules on something, they don't have any enforcement ability. They don't have a police force that goes out and says, okay, all the schools need to desegregate. It's just the law, but by the court, but Congress had to actually pass a specific law, which they did in the Civil Rights Act. And then the one thing that wasn't included in the Civil Rights Act was voting rights. So they passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which completed the implementation of the 15th Amendment. So what we saw here was that in 55, after Brown v. Board of Education, the court outlaws segregated schools, but only 1% of school actually desegregates. Until the Civil Rights Act, then we start to see more movement. And by 1972, 91% of the schools had desegregated. Post-Civil Rights era was a time where affirmative action policies were put into place or tried to be put into place. And so you should know what affirmative action is. It's direct steps to recruit members of previously underrepresented groups. So this could be African Americans, Native Americans, disabled people, but disrepresented, but it was mostly African Americans or people of color that were disrepresented in groups in schools and in jobs. So you need to know that affirmative action was trying to help even the playing field, so to speak, in education and in employment. Unfortunately, it had a disproportionate impact. Some policies felt like the discrimination, even if it wasn't conscious and wasn't consciously intended, might have discriminated in the opposite way. Maybe giving people of color jobs that would have gone to white people. So this was affirmative action eventually created a backlash from people who failed to get jobs. And we had to look at equal opportunity and equal outcome. Equal opportunity was giving each person the same chance to achieve success, but equal outcome was reserving jobs and opportunity for individuals based on race and gender. There were some court cases. This University of California v. Bach, the Supreme Court ruled that the universities may not establish a racial quota, that this is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Although the use of race can be a plus factor in admissions. Two other affirmative action attempts. One was minority quotas, and that was reserving places in universities for members of minority groups. So that's what this court case was up against. The other one was school busing. This is an effort to integrate public schools by mixing students from different neighborhoods. Many cities across the nation tried this, including Las Vegas, and there were some problems, but the intention was that if children could integrate into mixed schools, then maybe this racism underlying would go away. And it would be a way to integrate schools, because especially in Las Vegas at that time, it was very segregated. The North and the South were segregated. But in the last, let's say since the 80s, the last 30 years or so or more, the schools in Southern Nevada are quite diverse and integrated, so we don't need to use this. But during this time, school busing was an attempt to try to integrate schools. They came up with a lot of resistance, and you can read more about that in your book. As far as affirmative action, this is a comedian who has a program called the Patriot Act, and he touches on different topics. Hasan Minhaj, he talks about affirmative action. It's quite long, and it is kind of an opposite. He's talking about something that is currently happening. I highly recommend you watch this, although I won't be asking you questions on it. Then getting on to women's rights. So women's suffrage, or gaining the right to vote, began in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. It was the first time women got together and said, hey, something's wrong here. Up until that time, there was a custom of the laws of coverture, which came over from Great Britain. It was English common law that meant a woman's political rights and duties all operated through her husband. This is in bold because this will be on your exam. You need to know what this was. It's not a law in the United States, but it was the custom that women from Great Britain came over with. The expanded women's right to vote in most Western states and Midwestern states happened way before the whole United States did. And in World War II, women took an expanded role in the workplace and started pressuring the White House and the administration for suffrage, for the right to vote. They said, hey, we took a role in the workplace. We've done all this stuff. We need to have the right to vote. The passage of the 19th Amendment was in 1920. Gave women the right to vote. You should remember that date. And as you can see by this map, many women in other states had the right to vote in their state way before they were able to vote in the federal elections. It's been a slow climb. We can see that the percentage in state legislatures of women is still around 25%. However, I don't have it in here. Oh, darn. I had a link for this last year was the first time that both Colorado and Nevada had a majority of women in their legislature, which is an amazing feat. Actually, did I put it here? No, that's not it. Anyway, moving on. So in the Civil Rights Act, they had listed barred discrimination based on race, color, religion, and somebody had kind of, as a mischievous joke, entered sex into the act. So from the act, they started the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they were charged with monitoring the compliance of the Civil Rights Act. An organization called the National Organization for Women, now they formed in 1966, and they drew directly from the tactics that they saw the civil rights movement using. And they took this policy and Title VI denied federal funds to programs that discriminated against all of these things, including women. And Title IX, many of you might have heard of Title IX, required that equal athletic opportunities for men and women. So once this was passed, this organization now moved forward and started saying, hey, wait a minute, women of all schools need to have the same money needs to be spent on women's sports as on men's sports. And then we have the Equal Rights Amendment. This was first brought to Congress in 1924 and then again in 1972. It was passed in Congress in 1972, and it basically says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied on the account of sex. We all know that still women are getting somewhere between 75 and 85 cents to the dollar, and this amendment to the Constitution would make it law that women absolutely need to be paid the same amount as men for the same work. It passed in Congress, and then it needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, and it was moving along really quickly, and it was only shy of 3 states. And then this woman, Phyllis Schlafly, reframed the issue, and your book talks about reframing the issue. And she was arguing that the ERA threatened traditional family life, and that just killed it right there. No other states ratified it. She said that most women want to be a wife, mother, and a homemaker. So, not being a face-to-face class, I can't see the reaction of any of the women in this class, but if your reaction is like mine, you probably want to strangle this woman. What was she thinking? But it reframed the issue. However, it's been reintroduced every year and it has not come to a vote in over 30 years. 11 states have passed their own equal rights amendment. And not last year, sorry, 2 years ago, in 2017, the Nevada legislature passed the ERA amendment. So that meant that two more states were needed. Actually, only one more state is needed because let's go to this map here. This is just a countdown calendar, 72 days until the Congress ends. And so before the end of Congress, Congress would need to extend the limit, which would be a very easy thing for them to do. But enough states have passed it. We only need one more state. Nevada and Illinois were the last two. One of these states could pass the Equal Rights Act, and then we would have equal pay for men and women. So there you have it. So if you know anyone who lives in those states and you want to go work on a campaign, that's one to do. All right, so 1981 saw the first woman Supreme Court justice. 2 to 3 of the justices are women now. In 1964, 9% of American women got bachelor's degrees. Now it's 37% of women compared to 30% of men. In 1972, the first CEO made the Fortune 500. In 2000, that was 3. 2016, we had 22 run Fortune 500 companies. But we still have issues like abortion, equality, and women's right in the workplace. And as everyone knows, the Me Too movement that are still issues today. All right, so for Hispanics is the largest minority group in the United States. They've been challenging discrimination for a long time. They established the LULAC organization in 1929, used some of the same tactics as NAACP. They fought segregation through lawsuits and activism, and they formed unions, especially the United Farm Unions. This is highlighted in bold because this will be on your exam. Your book talks about public opinion polls. It says fears that are triggered by immigrants. This doesn't mean everyone in America, but the polls that they took. And so I just want you to look at the fears. They say immigrants always trigger the same fears. These were the top 4 fears: that they will undermine American values and culture, that they will take away jobs, that they will cling to their own language, and that they remain loyal to their countries of origin and their supposedly un-American ideas. This isn't highlighted because I think it's true, but we do need to understand what people are thinking, what they're afraid of. Unfortunately, a lot of these things, like taking away the jobs, there's no statistical evidence that shows that. I haven't heard anything about clinging to the language or whether that's important. And most Hispanics are very, or immigrants are very happy to be in America. So Hispanics and other immigrant groups fall into 3 categories. We have citizens. These are people that are born in the United States of immigrant parents or have become American citizens. This makes up roughly 60% of the Latino population. Then we have resident aliens. These are foreigners who are not citizens. They may work and pay taxes, but they are denied benefits of citizenship. My husband was a resident alien for 33 years and just became a citizen recently, so he went from this category to this category. And then there is unregistered, or sometimes called undocumented immigrants that are not legal residents. Most of them arrive on temporary visas and remain after their legal time in the country has expired. You can read this part. I'm going to skip over that. The breakdown of Hispanics by countries goes along these lines. The majority are from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Salvadorans, Cubans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, Colombians, and others. Asian Americans, among the first Asian Americans to arrive were the Chinese. They came to be railroad workers. It was a very poor economy in the 1880s. It led to a lot of racism against Chinese that Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barred Chinese immigrants from citizenship. In 1917, Congress extended that ban to all natives of Asia, including the whole of India. And then in 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law Act, which basically said aliens were ineligible for citizenship, could not own any land. And then we also had the Japanese internment after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans were taken from their homes and placed in cold, flimsy, miserable internment camps. Their liberty, jobs, property, and bank accounts were confiscated. So this is in bold. You'll be asked a question on that. And this is the makeup of Asians in America, largest being Chinese, next Indian, then Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Pakistani, Cambodian, Hmong, and others. And then we also have the civil rights era of our Native Americans. The dark side of American expansion was a policy of Indian removal. Tocqueville was famous. He said, "It is impossible to imagine the terrible afflictions of these forced migrations. There is famine behind them, war ahead, and misery everywhere." The most important thing on this page you need to know is that by the time the United States stretched from coast to coast, less than 1 million of the estimated 10 million Native Americans remained. That means in a short period of time, 9 million out of 10 million were killed or died. That's 90% of the population. In 1831, the Supreme Court ruled that the Indian tribes were classified as domestic dependent nations. This essentially meant they were separate people but without the rights of an independent nation. So they were a dependent nation on the United States, but they were separate people and they had their own reservations. Native Americans were not considered citizens protected by the Constitution until the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. If you can remember, on our last lecture, we read on the 3/5 clause, it also said excluding Indians. So they were not even counted. Many Native Americans live on tribal reservations, which are independent jurisdictions not subject to state governments. There's a lot of social problems on several of the reservations, low education levels, but it depends on the tribe. Some are doing very well. Oftentimes they open their own businesses. Many of them have opened casinos where they've been able to create a lot more money for the communities. Then you have Americans with Disabilities. Section 504, this is an obscure provision in an obscure Rehabilitation Act that required all institutions receiving federal funds to accommodate people with disabilities. So this Disabilities Act was, because a congressional staffer slipped the wording taken from the Civil Rights Act, they were able to forbid companies from not accommodating people. That's a double negative, but basically with the Americans Disabilities Act, companies of 25 or more employees could not discriminate against handicapped people, so they had to have whatever accommodations were needed for ramps, for people in wheelchairs, or and so this Section 504 is, if any of you had any disabilities, when you're taking class, you know about Section 504, and you can fill out a form for accommodations in school. Groups with special protection, sexual orientation, and gender identity. You can take a look at this video. Talks about the Stonewall riots. This was the beginning of the gay community movement, LGBTQ community. And then in the the 1980s, the gay community got together to confront AIDS, which was a harrowing plague in its early years, still is, but not as bad as when we didn't know what it was. That pushed them into politics and health provision and community building. So it forced this activist community to establish links with the medical community. They established connections with their local governments, and they prodded politicians and drug companies into action. So these are the things that this advocacy group did. It is in bold. You will be asked a question on the exam. There were also barriers to military service for people who were gay. The military did not allow you to be gay at all. And under Bill Clinton, they tried to make a policy to fix that. They ended up with a compromise policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which basically permitted gay individuals to serve as long as they kept their sexual orientation hidden. This policy was ended 18 years later under the Obama administration, and that should be in bold because you will be asked about that as well. Let's see. Vermont legalized same-sex unions in 2000. Massachusetts legalized the first same-sex marriages in 2003, and then this court case, Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015 legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. And then we have transgender citizens that face harassment and discrimination these days. We've had issues about restroom usage in several southern states. In one national sample, 41% have reported attempting suicide. So transgender activism focuses on educating fellow citizens and ensuring basic civil rights. The California School Success and Opportunity Act ensures transgender students the right to fully participate in all school activities, sports, teams, programs, and facilities that match their gender identity. All right, so the fight for civil rights still goes on. Voting rights today. Democrats try to make voting easier. Republicans have tried to make voting a little more difficult. Supreme Court made restricting the vote easier in 2013 when they struck down the central requirement for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Supreme Court in 2013 basically said, oh, we don't need this act anymore. And then it made the restricting of voters a lot easier. So this is not a good thing. We still have problems with economic and social rights in the matter of healthcare, income, incarceration, sometimes being called the new Jim Crow laws. Your book talks a little bit about the rates of people of color being incarcerated more than whites with no substantial reasoning related to that. All right, here are your exam notes for civil rights. You need to know what the Jim Crow system is. You need to know these two terms, de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination. You should know about Plessy v. Ferguson case, that it adopted separate but equal, and Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned separate but equal. The affirmative action, there's several different affirmative action, busing, quotas. Be familiar with the fact that affirmative action is trying to help previously disenfranchised people in education and employment. You should know what the laws of coverture are and what the 19th Amendment, when the 19th Amendment was. That was the right to vote for women. The fears that are triggered by immigrants. That was one of the slides in bold. Japanese internment. the title for Native Americans, domestic dependent nation, as well as their death toll during the colonization of America. 9 million died out of 10 million. You should know about the American Disabilities Act and what the advocacy groups of the gay community did in the 1980s. And you should know about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which president put Don't Ask, Don't Tell into effect, and which president eliminated Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The story isn't over on that. This current president is making efforts to roll back those efforts, so more to be continued in the future. Okay, this is a hard topic, a lot of issues. If you've read the book and watch all the videos, it is can be emotional at times, but we fight on for civil rights for all. Thank you, and I will talk to you on the next lecture.